You were never meant to hear what happened inside that room at Sweetwater. If you feel the air shift as I speak, if some part of you senses a door opening behind you that wasn't there before, that is because this story was buried for a reason. Men of wealth, power, and reputation wanted it erased not because it was too shameful, but because it revealed the machinery they relied on. A machinery so cold, so rational, so calculated, that once you understand it, you begin to see how much of today still operates on the same blueprint. On a winter night in Georgia, 1838, a plantation owner named Nathaniel Brennan brought his wife into a locked room not to comfort her, not to share grief over her infertility, but to use her, to teach her, to mold her into something he needed. She sat in the corner with a pen, trembling, staring at a ledger whose blank page felt like a mouth waiting to swallow her whole. That page would become a record of something she did not choose, something she could not stop, something she could never unsee. And what she wrote would bind her to the man she married in ways no wedding vow could ever replicate. Nathaniel stood over her with the stillness of a man who believed he was acting under the authority of science. Men like him had begun reading new theories coming out of Charleston and Augusta, ideas whispered in private societies, printed in journals not sold publicly. Ideas that claimed human beings could be engineered, improved, controlled. Ideas that taught men how to turn people into property, property into capital, and capital into a legacy. And on this night, Nathaniel decided to put those ideas into practice. He told his wife she would observe. She would record. She would document the process he intended to repeat for years. He needed her not as a partner, but as a witness, a participant under duress, a prisoner made to watch. She had been raised on etiquette, on scripture, on the quiet expectations placed upon Southern women. None of that prepared her for the cold, clinical cruelty her husband now revealed cruelty he justified with the language of rational improvement, economic necessity, and natural order. And the worst part, the part she would never escape, was not the violence itself. It was the realization that her husband's mind was not deranged. It was disciplined. It was deliberate. It was following a plan. By the flickering candlelight, the room became a theater of control, a laboratory where morality and empathy were suspended. Nathaniel Brennan was no impulsive tyrant. He was meticulous, precise, and patient, the kind of man who reads volumes on natural philosophy, not for curiosity, but to wield knowledge like a weapon. He believed he was creating order, shaping life itself, and in that belief, he found a twisted justification for acts that, if exposed, would have ensured his ruin. But the truth, the unspeakable truth, is that men like him thrived in secrecy. They thrived where systems protected them, where institutions turned a blind eye, and where silence was currency. His wife, Catherine, had spent her life learning how to command a household, how to navigate social rituals, how to measure her value in polite society. Now she was stripped of all agency. Her task was simple in wording, impossible in spirit. Observe, record, endure. Every mark of the pen was a surrender, every ledger entry a quiet consent under duress. She became a historian of horrors, chronicling a world that existed in plain sight, yet hidden from those who could stop it. The system relied on this invisibility. What the world did not see, it could not condemn. Outside Sweetwater, Milledgeville thrived on the illusion of civility. Red clay roads, white columns, polite gatherings where men in polished boots discussed crops, trade, and politics. But behind closed doors, behind the facade of refinement, the plantation economy ran on exploitation codified by law. The enslaved were property, their bodies tools for profit, their children assets. Nathaniel's experiments pushed this dynamic into a new dimension. Not just labor, but controlled reproduction, the engineering of human life itself. And Catherine, educated and intelligent, became complicit, her intellect harnessed against her own conscience. She understood more than she wanted to, recognized patterns of manipulation, of control, of hierarchy, yet had no outlet, no means to challenge the architecture she was forced to document. This is what makes it more than history. This is psychology, strategy, and corruption in action. Nathaniel's methods relied on more than dominance, they relied on normalization. The victim observes, the witness participates, and the wider society remains oblivious, conditioned to believe that some rules exist for the greater good, while the machinery of power operates unchecked. And once you see it, you begin to notice it everywhere. How authority manipulates perception, how institutions shape morality, how people are trained to accept what should be intolerable. The invisible chains tighten not through force alone, but through calculated orchestration, through repetition, through secrecy. Halfway through this descent, I want you to do something. In the comments, type the phrase, "I see the hidden hand" twice. Do this deliberately and understand that this act is more than ritual. It is acknowledgement. It is recognition that you are beginning to perceive the structures most ignore. You are participating in the awakening that Catherine was denied. Catherine's descent into witnesshood was not a slow drift, it was a deliberate immersion into the architecture of domination. She learned quickly that Nathaniel's control extended beyond physical coercion. It was psychological, ritualized, almost ceremonial. Each encounter, each session, each ledger entry was framed with precision, as though he were instructing her in the sacred mechanics of power itself. He taught her, without words, how observation becomes obedience, how documentation becomes complicity, and how silence is transformed into authority for the observer. In this way, Catherine's mind became a battlefield, torn between instinctive horror and enforced participation, between moral outrage and the relentless pull of enforced duty. The enslaved people were not just property. They were variables in an equation, objects of statistical calculation. Nathaniel studied them like crops. He noted strength, endurance, complexion, temperament, lineage. He believed he could engineer a superior labor force, and Catherine was his appointed recorder. The ledger she kept would catalog every nuance, every mark of human variance, as if she were tracking plant growth or the breeding of livestock. And in doing so, she began to see a pattern that was far more insidious than mere greed: the systematic erasure of personhood, the transformation of living human beings into data points for someone else's legacy. It was a blueprint for control, a strategy of domination disguised as rational science, and it extended far beyond Sweetwater. Men like Nathaniel were not anomalies. They were the executioners of an ideology deeply embedded in the Southern economy, a network of wealth and influence that valued human life only insofar as it could be quantified, owned, or reproduced. Catherine's private reflections, scribbled in the shadows, reveal what most history books omit: the psychological warfare inherent in the system. Nathaniel's plan relied on compliance not through direct threat alone, but through structured indoctrination. By forcing her to observe, by insisting on her chronicling of events, he created a mirror in which she saw the machinery in motion and felt powerless to intervene. This is the same method by which institutions maintain control today: normalize the impossible, frame obedience as duty, and turn conscience into a ledger that records participation. It is subtle. It is insidious. It is invisible to those who have not learned to see. And yet, in Catherine's horror, there was also awakening. She began to perceive the architecture of domination, the ways a system bends individuals into instruments of its own perpetuation. Every night she sat with pen in hand, she recognized patterns of power, manipulation, and complicity that few dared to name. And in that recognition, a seed of understanding was planted, an understanding that would haunt her, and the truth of which still reverberates through history, waiting for those who dare to look beyond the surface. Nathaniel's vision extended beyond mere exploitation. It was a carefully constructed system of calculated outcomes, designed to maximize control and minimize resistance. He treated human lives as variables in a complex experiment, predictable, measurable, and profitable. For him, morality was irrelevant. Only efficiency mattered. Catherine watched as the system unfolded before her eyes, each day revealing new layers of manipulation. The enslaved were disciplined, their bodies catalogued, their futures dictated by a man who saw nothing but utility. And in the quiet corners of her mind, Catherine began to see the unthinkable, the blueprint of power itself, a template that could be applied not only to plantations but to entire societies. What made Nathaniel's system terrifyingly effective was its invisibility. To the outside world, Sweetwater remained a model of refinement and civility. Guests admired the symmetry of the house, the meticulous gardens, the polite dinners. Yet behind those walls, a hidden order operated with surgical precision. Authority was enforced not only through fear, but through the illusion of normalcy. The enslaved learned compliance not just from punishment, but from the totality of the system, the constant reinforcement that their lives were monitored, recorded, and owned. And Catherine, as the designated witness, became both observer and instrument, an unwilling participant in the perpetuation of this hidden machinery. This is the essence of institutional corruption. It is not chaos, it is design. Systems do not merely oppress through brute force, they train their victims to enforce their own subjugation, often through those they trust. Catherine's pen became a tool of surveillance, her knowledge a weapon wielded unknowingly. She chronicled births, physical traits, health, and temperament, not to save, not to heal, but to feed the ledger of a man who believed he could engineer life itself. And in doing so, she glimpsed the psychological architecture of domination, understanding that power works best when it masks itself as duty, obligation, or natural order. What she saw was not an anomaly. Nathaniel's methods were extreme, yes, but the principles behind them persist. Today, systems continue to shape perception, normalize compliance, and manipulate consent. The lesson is brutal. Authority does not always shout. Often it whispers. It instructs, it educates, it seduces. And those who believe themselves merely observers may find, too late, that they have become participants. Halfway through her journey, Catherine realized that knowledge itself could be a trap. The more she understood, the more isolated she became. Awareness was both weapon and cage, a paradox that you, listening now, must recognize. Seeing the system is the first step. Surviving its grip is another. By the time Catherine had spent months in that role, the patterns of control had become almost hypnotic. Nathaniel's methods were no longer merely physical or procedural, they were psychological rituals, repeated with precision, designed to normalize the unnatural. The enslaved learned obedience through anticipation, through understanding that every action, every glance, every subtle deviation could be recorded and exploited. And Catherine, though horrified, had internalized the rhythm of this system. She could predict what he would do next, when he would select, when he would manipulate. Her intellect, once a source of pride and independence, had been weaponized against her own morality. Nathaniel's obsession was not simply about increasing his labor force, it was about asserting dominion, establishing a legacy that extended beyond property into the manipulation of life itself. He saw himself as a cultivator, a gardener of human potential, and he believed in his methods with the certainty of a man convinced of his rightness. And yet, Catherine perceived something far darker than rationalism or ambition. She saw the corruption of the soul, the way a mind trained on logic and efficiency could justify acts that stripped humanity from others. She observed how power, especially when absolute, systematic, and invisible, corrupts not only action but thought. This is the lesson that resonates beyond Sweetwater. Systems of domination do not collapse under exposure alone. They endure because they disguise themselves as normalcy, reason, or necessity. They rely on witnesses who are complicit through coercion or convenience, who document and record, who rationalize survival as acceptance. Catherine's diary became a testament not only to horror, but to the architecture of influence, the hidden networks that dictate behavior while maintaining the illusion of freedom. And this is where history is often silent. Those who see the machinery are trapped between knowledge and action. Those who act without awareness are trapped in ignorance. And so, the experiment continued. Night after night, ledger page after ledger page, Catherine became the silent archivist of human manipulation. She recorded strength, health, temperament, endurance, all of it catalogued with clinical precision. Nathaniel's correspondence with other planters revealed that this was not an isolated pursuit. He was part of a network, men exchanging strategies, sharing observations, reinforcing a system built on secrecy, hierarchy, and control. Now, if you are following closely, I want you to engage intentionally. In the comments, write the phrase, "I see the hidden hand" twice. This is not mere ritual. This is recognition that you are no longer a passive observer. You are anchoring awareness in action. You are aligning yourself with the ability to perceive systems others cannot. This is the moment where understanding begins to shape identity. Nathaniel's operations reveal something that most histories will not acknowledge. Power functions not through chaos, but through meticulous design. Every act, every instruction, every ledger entry was calculated to reinforce hierarchy, obedience, and complicity. He understood, instinctively, that control does not require brute force alone. It requires consent coerced, structured, and habitual. By placing Catherine in the role of witness, he extended his dominion beyond physical enforcement into the realm of the mind. Her intellect, once a shield, became part of the machinery cataloging behaviors, traits, and reactions. She was observing, learning, and documenting the mechanisms of subjugation without the ability to intervene. And this is where the horror truly lies. Power embedded in routine, normalized by repetition, and rationalized through ideology. The enslaved at Sweetwater had no recourse. They were trapped not only by law, not only by violence, but by systems designed to anticipate resistance. Nathaniel monitored, recorded, and manipulated. Strength, endurance, health, demeanor all cataloged, analyzed, and used to plan the next phase of his experiment. Catherine noted it all, feeling the crushing weight of complicity pressing against her chest. She had been trained by her education, her upbringing, and her position to understand order, hierarchy, and efficiency, but nothing had prepared her for the moral architecture of cruelty dressed as science. And it is here that you must pay attention. Institutions often operate on the same principle. They teach obedience through ritual, structure compliance as duty, and normalize control as natural order. The psychological framework Nathaniel employed was deliberate. It created internalization of authority. By making Catherine observe and document, he ensured that she carried the truth within her mind, and that her sense of agency was bound to his design. She understood what was happening, recognized the system, and yet could not act. This is the core principle of elite control. Awareness without freedom is a tool for power. Knowledge becomes a tether, perception a weapon against conscience. And here is the crucial insight. Systems endure because they recruit their own observers. Witnesses become participants. Observers become instruments. And once you understand the architecture of control, how coercion, ritual, and secrecy combine, you recognize a pattern that extends beyond plantations, beyond history, into institutions, networks, and hierarchies that shape behavior even today. This is the descent into understanding, and the point where you see how power operates beneath the surface. Awareness is dangerous. Knowledge is dangerous, but it is also transformative. And Catherine's story is not just horror, it is instruction. By now, Catherine had become something she never intended. A living archive of oppression, a witness to the engineering of life, and an unwilling participant in the normalization of cruelty. Each night, as she recorded the traits, health, and dispositions of those forced into Nathaniel's design, she realized something essential. Control was more than physical, it was structural, psychological, and strategic. She had been trained by her education, her upbringing, and her position to understand order, hierarchy, and efficiency, but nothing had prepared her for the moral architecture of cruelty dressed as science. And it is here that you must pay attention. Institutions often operate on the same principle. They teach obedience through ritual, structure compliance as duty, and normalize control as natural order. The psychological framework Nathaniel employed was deliberate. It created internalization of authority. By making Catherine observe and document, he ensured that she carried the truth within her mind, and that her sense of agency was bound to his design. She understood what was happening, recognized the system, and yet could not act. This is the core principle of elite control. Awareness without freedom is a tool for power. Knowledge becomes a tether, perception a weapon against conscience. And here is the crucial insight. Systems endure because they recruit their own observers. Witnesses become participants. Observers become instruments. And once you understand the architecture of control, how coercion, ritual, and secrecy combine, you recognize a pattern that extends beyond plantations, beyond history, into institutions, networks, and hierarchies that shape behavior even today. This is the descent into understanding, and the point where you see how power operates beneath the surface. Awareness is dangerous. Knowledge is dangerous, but it is also transformative. And Catherine's story is not just horror, it is instruction. By now, Catherine had become something she never intended. A living archive of oppression, a witness to the engineering of life, and an unwilling participant in the normalization of cruelty. Each night, as she recorded the traits, health, and dispositions of those forced into Nathaniel's design, she realized something essential. Control was more than physical, it was structural, psychological, and strategic. Nathaniel's genius, if it can be called that, was not in violence but in orchestration. Every detail, every subtle reinforcement of hierarchy, every calculated act of observation was designed to produce compliance. And in this, he was not unique. He was the embodiment of systems that have persisted throughout history, systems that bend human behavior toward objectives concealed behind facades of duty, law, or necessity. Catherine's consciousness became a battlefield. On one side, moral outrage, empathy, and the instinct to resist. On the other, the relentless pressure of enforced observation, the responsibility to document, and the realization that understanding the system made her powerless in the face of its machinery. She saw that knowledge itself could imprison as effectively as chains, that awareness of manipulation can bind the observer as surely as the enslaved. She began to comprehend how elites across time cultivate control, by turning observation into participation, consent into compulsion, and perception into an instrument of the very structure one might otherwise oppose. Outside Sweetwater, the plantation thrived on illusion. Polished floors, fragrant gardens, social rituals, all masking the precise mechanisms of exploitation occurring behind closed doors. Nathaniel's correspondence with other planters revealed a network of men who shared strategies, exchanged advice, and reinforced each other's methods of domination. They were, in essence, architects of human behavior, applying the principles of selective breeding, surveillance, and normalization in pursuit of legacy, wealth, and control. And Catherine, forced to witness, began to perceive a truth few ever acknowledge. Power sustains itself not through force alone, but through subtle, repeated, and concealed systems of influence. The lesson is terrifying because it is still relevant. Modern institutions, hierarchies, and organizations operate on similar principles. Observe, normalize, record, influence, and repeat. Those who understand these mechanisms have insight. Those who internalize them unwittingly become instruments. And those who resist without understanding often fail. Catherine's experience illuminates the hidden architecture of power, showing how knowledge, coercion, and complicit observation combine to enforce dominance across generations. If you are following closely, take a moment now. Reflect. You are learning to see what most cannot. You are recognizing the machinery in motion. And if you want to solidify that recognition, remember the words, "I see the hidden hand," twice. Let it anchor awareness as you descend further into the truths that were never meant to be revealed. By the time the years passed, Sweetwater Plantation had become a testament to human ingenuity used for cruelty, a place where life itself was catalogued, manipulated, and commodified. Catherine's role had shifted subtly yet profoundly. She was no longer simply a victim or observer, she had become a guardian of secrets, a living record of the structures that made exploitation invisible and systematic. She understood, with a clarity that terrified her, that what Nathaniel had built was more than a plantation. It was a model, a framework for control that could extend into any sphere: economic, social, political, and the principles behind it were chillingly timeless. The horror of Catherine's story lies not in the acts themselves, but in the architecture they revealed. Nathaniel's methodical approach, his network of correspondence, the careful documentation of human traits, all of it reflects a principle as old as power itself. Domination thrives most efficiently when it is hidden in plain sight, when compliance is internalized, and when observers are enlisted into complicity. By forcing Catherine to watch, to record, and to endure, he transformed her awareness into a tool of control. And this is the pattern repeated across centuries. Systems ensure their survival by co-opting consciousness, converting insight into service for the very structures one might wish to dismantle. What you are hearing now is not merely history. It is instruction, a lens through which to recognize the invisible forces operating around you. Look closely at institutions, hierarchies, and networks. Observe how rules, rituals, and normalized behavior bend perception. Notice how the witnesses those tasked with oversight, record-keeping, or observation often become the most effective instruments of power. Sweetwater was extreme, but its logic survives. Power today works not through overt cruelty alone, but through subtler manipulations, shaping knowledge, codifying obedience, and controlling who sees what. Catherine's descent into the secret world transformed her forever. And listening to this, you have begun a similar journey, one that carries both danger and empowerment. Awareness changes the landscape of your mind. Recognition shifts identity. Understanding without action can feel like paralysis, but action without comprehension is reckless. The path forward is to see, discern, and choose your alignment wisely. Remember what you have done to reach this point. You have witnessed the machinery. You have acknowledged it. You have typed the phrase that anchors your recognition. The next step is yours. Carry this awareness into the world, but never forget the weight of forbidden knowledge. Some truths, once known, cannot be unseen. And now, because you have descended with Catherine, because you have traced the invisible architecture of power, you will never perceive reality the same way again. Some truths are buried for a reason. Type, "I see the hidden hand," twice in the comments to claim your awareness. Subscribe and ring the bell, because once you see the machinery, you can't unsee it. Watch closely. Question everything. Power always operates in silence. And now you know where to look.